now, I would like to introduce you to our host today, Mark Grimshaw, the Executive Director of Global Consultancy for Korn Ferry.
Good afternoon, everybody, and good morning, and thank you for taking the time to be with us today. We recognise how difficult circumstances are, both personally and in your business lives, so we really appreciate it. Our goal for this webinar series is to share ideas that might help you keep your businesses moving forward, whether that's about your personal leadership, keeping your people motivated and productive, or caring for the financial health of your organisation or your teams. And today we're here to talk about the impact of social distancing. We all know what that is now, of course, but how many of us would have recognised the word, let alone the concept, 3 months ago? And this unprecedented and truly global situation is genuinely brand new to almost everybody. And with that newness comes the opportunity to do things differently. What happens when in-person meetings aren't possible? Which, let's face it, is the reality for many salespeople, as the global spread of COVID-19 drives selling and buying organizations to adopt no travel and no meetings, and now social distancing policies. I used to work for a strategic consultancy firm some years ago, and we as a company would travel the equivalent of the distance to the moon and back 3 times a week. Imagine just stopping that literally overnight. So we've been researching sales behavior for decades, and the data's really tough. Even without the travel and meeting constraints of COVID-19, only 31% of organizations say that they can effectively identify and gain access to decision makers. Only 40% say that they successfully use questioning skills to reveal buyers' realized and unrealized needs. And only slightly more than half of them can articulate solutions well. And that data is in a world where they can travel, they can visit, they can see face to face, they can sit with their clients. So think about your own relationships, business or personal, and consider what's happened to them in times of adversity, because we are certainly in times of adversity. I'm sure you can all think of circumstances where you've been tested and maybe you've triumphed or maybe you've failed. One that comes to mind for me is a great example of building relationships with sometimes strangers in the case in adversity. In this case, it was the weather. So it's November. In the UK as it is, and a small team of colleagues and I crashed together to try and assemble, of all things, a hangar on an airfield because a storm is coming. Now, we don't have proper storms in the UK in the way that we do in North America and in parts of the Far East, but nevertheless, it was going to be windy. We didn't know each other that well, but a local charity had restored some aeroplanes and they were sitting on the hangar and would be outside and would be damaged if they were left in the elements. So we start to work together and frankly, everything goes wrong. The panels don't fit. The hangar was donated, so we couldn't complain, but the panels don't fit. The hardware's missing. The wind comes early and batters us. And for 3 days, we return to the airfield every day. And I see in that group, I see kindness, I see frustration, surprisingly good and surprisingly poor behavior, but we finished the job. It turned out well. The winds topped 120 miles an hour that weekend, but the precious aeroplanes were safe. And importantly, our team formed a bond in that time of adversity that exists to this very day. So let's be clear. I hope that this crisis that we're going through with COVID-19 is far less dramatic than some of the things that you will all now be thinking in your own world. But I do suggest that with careful thought and planning, salespeople might be able to use these times to work with their clients and build valuable, enduring relationships. Companies are finding themselves, and you probably are on this call, as individuals or as leaders with large sales teams of what used to be frequent flyers grounded in the office and in fact now in their home office, functioning more like inside salespeople. So the question is, how do we keep salespeople focused on performance in the absence of physical presence? How do we create customer intimacy in an almost exclusively now virtual world? I mean, at Korn Ferry, we've completed nearly 70 million assessments on executives at all levels over the years in the pursuit of understanding what makes a great leader. And I would suggest that in times of adversity, we all need the characteristics of a leader, of our companies, of our teams, of our portfolios, sometimes even of our clients and our customers. And now more than ever, sales managers and salespeople need to lead. I put it to you that the challenge is not just to help our customers to survive, but how to help them thrive. And I don't mean take advantage of the situation. I mean adapt and learn and continue to serve their customers in this new and frankly slightly scary situation. So I'm delighted to be here today with two of my colleagues, Byron Matthews, who's the Chief Commercial Officer of Korn Ferry Digital, who will share his experiences in what salespeople can practically do to work through this challenging time. But first I'd like to introduce Celeste Lunsford. Celeste is our Chief Research Officer in Sales Effectiveness. She's been in the sales effectiveness space for over 25 years, and during that time has had the privilege of not just working with a large range of companies, B2B, B2C, and retail, on their unique selling challenges, but also collecting the insight of thousands of sales organizations across the world. So Celeste, help us put this in perspective. I know it's more complicated than it sounds, but on the surface, it seems like sellers should just be doing a lot of what they do today, but in a virtual format. Is it as simple as that?
Well, there's something to that for sure, Mark. So one of the things that we see when we look at sales as a whole is there's a great number of sales roles that are turning into inside sales roles. And if you look at talent across the sales spectrum, that's probably the role that's growing the most. And over the last couple of years, it's amazing really the complexity of solutions that people now sell purely from an inside sales model. And even taking it further, there's a whole bunch of commerce that happens B2B e-commerce. And in fact, B2B e-commerce is going to outpace B2C. So lots of that can be applied for sure. But having said that, 66%, or about 2/3 of sales positions, particularly in complex selling, are field-based roles. And those are expensive labor organizations to have. So the reason that they still exist is because they work. One of the things we see is that from a complex sales perspective, field people who use in-person calls well, so they place them at the beginning and the end of sales cycles, just have higher win rates. And a lot of the reason why tends to be those intangibles. Some of it's trust. So for example, there's the old adage of just, being able to look someone in the eye. Some of it is around the things that you can accomplish when you're on site. So for example, there's a lot of times you can gain an additional meeting because you happen to be in the building. And that's justification enough to be able to get a couple minutes. You might be able to get a little bit of extra rapport building. So you gain 45 minutes with an executive, but you might get an extra 3 minutes in the front and back end as you walk to and from exits. You pick up a lot of cues and clues around the culture of an organization. So there's just a lot of those sorts of things, and those are hard to replicate. So yes, you could take the same presentation deck and you could, instead of passing it out or projecting it on a screen, you could use a system like this to show it. But it's not going to replace those other intangibles. And those add up over the period of an interaction and over the period of a sales call. So when Mark was talking about the challenges that sellers have today, the challenge we see is we're going to have a group of sellers who are hired to sell in one way, asking to sell in a completely different way. Buyers who are used to buying in one way, buying in a different way. And both of them having a lot of things going on in their organizations that are causing them to change. So what's going to be created is this physical distance, this physical gap between people, and also an attention or a focus gap. And we hope that that's short term. The challenge, though, is it overlies what we've seen as a growing gap over the last 2 or 3 years, and that's an emotional gap. So buyers and sellers have been drifting apart for some time. So as important as those face-to-face calls are for sellers, buyers haven't been seeing them as relevant for the past couple of years. In fact, they offer less calls to salespeople. They're usually later in the sales process, and they're usually shorter. When we talk to buyers, 77% of them told us they're just not as connected to their sellers as they used to be. In fact, from their perspective, those sellers really don't provide the business connection that they did in the past. They're not a business resource for them. At the same time, those same buyers told us is they don't see a whole lot of difference between the sellers that win business that they think of as their best sellers and the ones who come in second place. 68% of them told us that they just don't see that much of a differentiation. And that's a problem because that represents a gap that was already there. Now, the good news is that 90% of those buyers said, well, that's not the way they think of necessarily every seller. In fact, what they said is there are times when I do want to engage and I find salespeople a lot more valuable to me. Those times are when a situation's challenging or it's risky, it's highly visible and complex. And that's basically the world that we all live in now. So when we look at this information and we see this physical gap and this connection, focus gap sitting on top of this emotional one, it could go two ways. One of which is we could leave this situation and sellers be even more disintermediated from buyers. The gap gets bigger. Or depending on how we go to market now, it might be an opportunity where we can start to close some of that gap. So it's more about the approach, not just can I take some of the things that I would do in person and do them virtually, but how do I need to change my approach, Mark? So I guess the question for you, Byron, as we transition over to the next speaker is, what are some of the levers that you would pull if you're going to change the approach?
Thanks, Celeste. So let's talk about sales performance in an environment that's less physical and more distant and virtual. Now, the key thing is that the fundamentals don't change. Whether you are on this call, you're a sales leader, a sales professional, individual contributor, or you support the sales function, the efficiency and the effectiveness of your sales funnel is based on a simple set of variables, and that's on the bottom of the slide here. So think about the first part of this. Think about what A and Q may represent for a second. So let's take the first part, A. This is the amount of activity. The amount of activity that you execute around your customers and your clients every single day. Now, with social distancing in a more virtual environment, this is less about face-to-face meetings, as Celeste said. So clearly the type of activity is shifting, but the amount should not. So you got to think about different ways of connecting with their clients. Obviously, more phone calls and Zoom meetings and email and social connecting. But this is the time to be more proactive than ever, to replace your face-to-face meetings, not with administration, but with other ways to connect with your client. But here's the key thing is the second piece, which is quality. It can't be activity for activity's sake, right? It's got to be high quality. And so the way to think about this is, think about a simple check. Ask yourself a question. What does the client or the customer get out of this interaction? Why make this phone call? What is it going to benefit them in terms of what things they're trying to solve or things that they're trying to achieve? And that should always be constantly in the back of your mind. It's easy to sometimes just pick up phones and try to set up a Zoom meeting or send an email, socially try to connect with somebody, but do it from the perspective of quality and continuously check yourself. But the key thing is this equation has got to be balanced. You cannot see a drop-off in activity and certainly quality just because we can't get in front of somebody face-to-face. Now, the key thing of this is, so what takes away from this A and this Q? Well, clearly T, which is time, the time that it takes to develop this activity with the right level of quality. And so if your idea is, hey, I'm going to put a piece of thought leadership together, I'm going to use this to send to my client and hopefully stimulate some ideas and then try to get a meeting, it's a great idea. But if it takes you forever or all day to put that thought leadership together, then that might not generate the level of activity that you need. And so get help. My advice would be, is you got an organization around you, talk to marketing, talk to your peers, find out various different ways that you can reduce the time to get high level of activity out in the market. Now, if you see this part of the equation, there's one more really important piece to it. All of this is divided by D. So think about second what D stands for. That's distraction. And it's pretty clear that today's environment, we have plenty of distraction. But there's two things I would ask you to think about. The first is, from your perspective, the world's greatest commercial teams, sales forces, they are hyper-focused on activity and the quality of activity. They are very disciplined organizations. So this is the time to be more disciplined than ever. Think about putting in measurements and metrics around activity during these times. Put benchmarks out there around how much activity do we want to have around our client. Look at your funnel, the shape of your funnel. Where do you need certain activity in different aspects of the stages in your funnel, and specifically put goals and metrics around that and manage that as an organization. But the second thing to think about is you're not the only one distracted. So are your clients, right? And the very specific impact these days have on them, you need to consider. And you need to think about, so what does that mean in terms of how I interact with them? What messaging? How do I help them? And so make sure that you're connecting with them from a position of value, not from what you need, because they're very distracted too, and time is going to be very limited. So this is a time that you got to really think about these equations. Think about what drives sales performance. Think about the various different variables. And now that we have social distance, less face-to-face meetings, the dynamics have changed, but the fundamentals have not. So how do you replace that with, again, quality activity that can be done efficiently, that's focused, not distracted, to drive performance in your sales funnel? So with that, Mark, I'd love to get some opinions from this group regarding various different priorities.
That'd be great. If we could go to the poll. So Celeste, over to you.
Absolutely. So this is a question that we have been asking our clients and the folks that we work with regard to what guidance are salespeople being given. So what guidance, and you can check all that apply, because I'm sure it's more than one thing, but what kind of guidance are you giving sellers on which of those levers that they do need to start pulling? So for example, one organization that we work with are saying things like, hey, I want people to really focus on top of funnel because the value proposition they have is very unique right now and very valued and could be very helpful. So they want to focus on casting a broader net. Another one might say, I really am focused more on bottom of the funnel. We've taken a lot of these opportunities a long way, and we need to figure out what has changed about what this client needs to fix, accomplish, or avoid, and what do we need to do to reconfigure our solutions. There's still others that are saying, you know what, I don't want my salespeople really focused on the funnel right now. The activities I think are going to have the higher ROI are service activities, right? I'm worried about implementations achieving milestones, and I think their time could be best spent out doing service type or customer success type work. There could be additional enablement opportunities. Lots of people looking at that quality lever that Byron mentioned. So that 10%, what kind of training should I offer? What do I need people to do? How am I giving them a little bit of guidance? It's hard as a salesperson right now to know how to approach a conversation like this. I want to engage with people, but I don't want to look inappropriate. Maybe it's around time. Big opportunity for efficiency here. Are we using tools the way we should be? Are there different things we should do to be more efficient? Or it might be all about engagement and culture and managing a distraction. And there's some organizations who have told us, frankly, we don't know enough to have changed our approach, and we're just going to go along with status quo and adapt on a daily basis. So hopefully, as I've been going on, you've checked all those that apply. And I'd love to see, Donna, whether or not we've got a consensus on things that might be appropriate right now. So we should be able to see the results in just a second. I know Zoom is a bit bogged down today, as you guys can imagine. Yeah. There's tons of webinars happening, and shout out to Zoom.
One moment, we're gonna try it one more time here.
Sure. And a shout out to Zoom, by the way, because they're also doing a lot of free work for educational purposes and folks trying to train from home.
Are you able to see it now?
We are able to see it. Thank you, Donna. And so, Byron, when I look at this, I'm not surprised in the sense that you'll see a pretty evenly distributed sense of activities there. A little more towards perhaps the activity than working through time. The good news is most people tend to be a bit proactive about it.
Yeah, I think they use tools and data more efficiently is an important one. I certainly want to touch on that next. So the sales equation, or the sales effectiveness equation that I spoke about earlier, kind of gives you the context of what drives sales performance, right? And it's times like this where that A times Q component of it is really, really important. So let's talk about a few ideas that you can consider that would maximize your performance in times like this. So let's start with this first one on the top left, redirect travel time to relationship building. You know, a part of our research would suggest that 32% of sellers' time is with client interaction. It's probably not as high as we'd like, but 10% of their time is in travel. Now, maybe that resonates with some of you or most of you, but there's certainly a lot of time spent with sellers travel. Well, now clearly now that is reduced. People are working from home. And so the question is, what are you going to do with that 10%? Right? What we would argue is don't move that to administration time. Don't move that to some dead weight loss where essentially you're trying to, stay at your 32 or 30% or whatever it might be around client interaction. Our advice would be use that time to drive more activity. Again, think about putting metrics in and goals in place around the amount of client interactions, again, on their terms, not yours. But this is a unique opportunity for many sellers who are on the road all the time to take that time and reinvest that in high leverage, high value type of client interactions. There's a marketing agency that we work close with, that their head of business development put a goal out there across all of their business development representatives that said, now that you're not traveling all over, I want you to spend that time connecting with 5 new people on social media every single day. So research your accounts. There's tons of people that you haven't connected to yet. You haven't got to that time yet. Find a way to connect with them. Use that time where you're not traveling to build and begin developing relationships. I think that was a great idea. The second piece around use your tech stack, and this was actually just came up in the poll that I think it was like 36% of you thought that this would be an area to further invest your time. The average, based on our sales operations study, this is actually a little bit, this was surprising when I saw it, but then as I started thinking about it and talking to clients, it's so true. The average organization has 10 pieces of technology that they deploy to help drive sales performance, sales productivity tools, 10. Now you can imagine that when you start double clicking on that data and start looking at the research, that so much of that is underutilized. And there's so much opportunity to improve the way that sales organization engages and leverages technology to drive productivity. Well, I think right now is a really good time to make that investment, to really understand how do I drive more effectiveness with the tools that I'm using, whether that's engagement platforms or customer success platforms or social media tools, whatever it is, what is in my environment and how do I get more leverage from it in times like this? And there's kind of simple things to think about. I'm sure we all have webinar, web-based platforms to be able to communicate with clients. There's features and functions I bet we typically don't use. For example, as we're now having more virtual meetings, ask your client or your customer if you can record those meetings. Right? This gives you better history of the notes and be able to reflect on that conversation, but it also gives people that support you, whether that's your sales leader or others, visibility to specific actions that can help you coach what the next move is. Or maybe video conference it. Ask them if you can go on a video, right? Because clearly that will provide more focus in the discussion, less multitasking. And so there's features and functions that we typically may not always use that you may want to consider. The third thing on the bottom left is repurposing content. It's important to know that now that we're in a virtual environment, content is used differently, right? If you're in face-to-face and you got a presentation, it's often easy because you're reading the room. You can see how people are reacting. You can stop the presentation, have a conversation, right? When it's virtual, it's oftentimes harder to do that. You can't necessarily read the room. So your content needs to be agile. You need to pause more, stop more, ask questions, ask for understanding and acceptance. And when you don't get it, you got to be able to adjust. So your content needs to adjust. Maybe you got to flip up really quick your financials or your value proposition. Go back to your main presentation. So think about your content in components and think about how you can leverage that in a Zoom environment or a virtual environment where you can quickly kind of adjust your approach based on how that meeting is going. So think carefully about your content. And then finally, leading with perspective. I actually think this is the most important one. I've alluded to pieces of this earlier around how to engage in times like this. So here's what we know. Regardless of this environment, we know that selling is changing, that the successful sellers have evolved. It's not just about needs-based or consultative type selling, showing up, asking questions, getting answers, understanding needs, and pitching a solution. That's actually not what the best do. Sure, that's a big part of it. But what they're also doing is adding value inside of that sales process, bringing content in, insights in, getting buyers to think differently about the problem or the solution that they're considering. It's adding value in the sense of helping them educate what to do next, what move to make. And this is a different selling motion. It's more difficult. It requires different skills and methodologies. In our vernacular, in our content, we call that perspective, okay? Today, and what we're going through right now, this couldn't be more important. So when you engage your client, make sure it's not from the position of your shoes, the things you're dealing with, and you're just trying to drive activity and check in on a project, but it's about what they're dealing with. What are some of the issues they may be facing given today's environment? How can you step in and help with them? And maybe that's connected to something you're selling, but maybe it's not. It's irrelevant. It's about being there for your customer. Good example of that is there's a sales, software as a service comp administration business, and they transact billions of records every single month. And they have unique insights into their clients' sales organization. And in one case, there's one of the certain clients that do a lot of work in retail and hospitality. And you can imagine the impact it's having on their clients. And so they're proactively bringing ideas to them around their sales force and certain compensation metrics they may want to consider in the short term during these times. And they have so much data to show up and give them an example of things they should be thinking about proactively doing with their sales force. And so whatever context you're in, whatever environment, whatever industry it might be, there's things that you do, ways that you help that can transcend just trying to sell a thing into actually helping them achieve your clients, whatever that might be, their objectives, whatever's going on in their world. So think about engagement and activity on their terms and not yours. And most importantly, be proactive and bold about helping them. Because this is the time where we all need to connect with each other and we all need to support each other.
Well, Byron, thank you so
much.
much.
With that, I'm going to turn this back over to Mark.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Byron. And I couldn't agree more from the perspective. A couple of questions have come up in the Q&A around how do I engage when clients are being in difficult situations themselves. And I think Byron's hit the nail on the head. Yeah, you need some technology and some techniques, but also just genuine, open. They're in the same situation that you're in, perhaps a better one, perhaps a slightly worse one, but genuine, open communication. You'd be surprised. In times of adversity, you'd be surprised. So thank you, Byron, for your time. We have a couple of minutes left, so just like to cover a number of people in the Q&A have also asked, can we have copies of the presentation? The answer is yes. We also have two places for you to go with QR codes here. The first one is a white paper or a paper on social distancing, which you can download our point of view, and it covers a lot of the things that are in here in the stats. And then also please go to our website, which is constantly being updated on just on the COVID-19 piece. So I'd like to just close with challenges that lie ahead of us are considerable, and most people are in a genuinely uncharted territory. So I leave you with the fact that I think it's incumbent on us to implement all of that learning agility that we hear so much about to help our clients in their endeavors and develop different and deeper relationships in times of adversity, and then help our customers, our teams, and ourselves to prepare for recovery, because this will recover, and when it does, we need to be ready. So thank you so much. Donna, over to you just for the final piece.
Thank you, everybody. That was a wonderful webinar today. And as Mark has said, and we want to remind you, this recording is going to be made available to everyone who registered. The slides will be made into a PDF for you to download, so you can access it and view it at any time. It'll be later this evening or tomorrow. And we hope that you have a chance to sign up for the ongoing series. Tomorrow we will be discussing keeping your people engaged and productive through the crisis. Thank you. The meeting has ended.